In this video, I want to talk about NATO and precisely the lie that Putin has put out there that it's all about NATO. NATO just keeps encroaching to the east, and that's why we had to invade Ukraine. So that's not really what happened. This is an article in Al Jazeera who actually does pretty good coverage of what's going on in Ukraine. And in Al Jazeera, this was covered in February 15th of 2022, before Putin invaded Ukraine. And this was the headline. Putin says he wants Ukraine NATO question resolved now. Okay, but was that really what was motivating? I don't think it was. This is Dmitry Kuleba. He is the Foreign Affairs Minister for Ukraine. And let's hear what he has to say about this. And you'll see how what Putin said just can't be true.
I sometimes hear people say that Russia was forced to attack Ukraine because Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. Those people also often say that NATO promised it would not expand to the east, but later broke this promise. And this, allegedly, is the reason why Russia keeps attacking its neighbors. If you have ever heard people say something like that, please know that this is not true. And it will take me less than 5 minutes to prove with facts that both statements are false. First, let's have a look at the timeline of events. Russia first invaded Ukraine in February 2014 by occupying the Crimea Peninsula. At that moment, Ukraine was a neutral country by law and expressed no intention of joining NATO whatsoever.
Now let's go back before that. So in 2008, NATO was saying, yeah, you know, Ukraine, one day you can join us as well. France and Germany weren't all that excited about it. Ukraine had corruption issues to deal with, but France and Germany really put the kibosh on it. From that point forward, Putin, I think, was starting to really think hard about taking Ukraine. In 2008 to 2014, there was this interim period where we're like, well, we don't really know what's going to happen. As of 2014, they couldn't. He said they're neutral by law. That means that they can't join NATO because to join NATO, you can't have a conflict going on within your borders. And from the moment that Putin rolled his troops over the borders in 2014, the whole question of Ukraine being able to join NATO was off the table just because of that. And then it's not like they're going to surprise you. You saw how long it took for Finland and Sweden to join, to get the consent of all the other NATO countries in order to join. Like, it took a long, long time. Sweden just joined. So it's not this whole idea that Putin just wants to, he's just worried about NATO being right up on his border. And how will you feel if Canada was joining Russia? Or it's a red herring. It just is.
For instance, during the Revolution of Dignity, the protesters insisted on Ukraine joining the EU, not NATO. It was only in autumn 2014, after many months of war, that Ukraine abandoned neutrality. So what came first? Russia attacking Ukraine or Ukraine wanting to join NATO? The answer is clear. Had Russia not threatened Ukraine's existence, there would be no reason for our country to seek collective security. So please do not repeat the lie that, I quote, Russia attacked because Ukraine wanted to join NATO, end of quote. This does not correspond with the facts. Now let's have a look at the story of NATO allegedly promising not to expand to the east. If you ask people who say this, when exactly such a promise was made and who made it, most of them will not be able to provide a clear answer. Spoiler, because no such promise has ever been made, and the whole story is a Russian fairy tale. Those more sophisticated will tell you that the promise was made to the president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Now, people have heard that again and again, and the way that Putin tells the story is that it was like a hard and fast law and a hard and fast rule. There was no way that they were going to happen. And then the West just wantonly broke and violated it because that's what the West does. It's a little bit of Freudian projection when Putin says that kind of thing about the West.
They may even refer to the 1990 US-Soviet negotiations on the reunification of Germany. Again, let's consider the timeline. In summer 1990, when these talks were held, the Soviet analog of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, still existed. Its dissolution, let alone the Soviet Union's dissolution, was not on the cards.
Yeah, in 1990, nobody could see that. And so this is what NATO looked like at the time. This was 1991, and they're allowing Germany to be reunified. Let's go back just a little bit. Okay, Germany here all the way through Norway. This is NATO. This neutral, and then this whole white and gray was all like kind of Warsaw, mostly Warsaw Pact countries, with the exception of Yugoslavia, which was really aligned with Russia, but not really Warsaw Pact. So nobody could anticipate that they could actually move east, like where there's nowhere to go because the Warsaw Pact was there. So that's the context that you need to understand about that conversation.
No one even talked about it or imagined it. It was only next year, in 1991, that the Warsaw Pact and later the USSR quite unexpectedly ceased to exist. Now explain to me just how the very issue could be even discussed in the summer of 1990. It is not surprising that Mikhail Gorbachev later himself refuted this falsehood.
So if the person that was theoretically promised, and that's Gorbachev was the one that they said they promised, that James Baker, the Secretary of State in the United States, promised this to, and he says that didn't actually happen. I mean, I believe the guy that was in on the conversation.
When asked by a journalist whether any such promise had been made, he said this was a myth. Now let's look at it from another perspective. How could NATO even promise anything like that? Initially, it is not NATO that decides which country joins it. Countries themselves need to want it, and actually, the membership criteria are very difficult. It requires a lot of political will and reform. All the NATO members that joined it after 1991 really wanted to be part of it. The people wanted this. And here comes the most uncomfortable question for Russia. Why were all of the nations that had been part of the Soviet Union or the socialist bloc so eager and desperate to join NATO?
Now that's a really good question. The way that Putin frames it is that their Western masters, particularly the United States, is just pulling the strings and making them have to join this alliance against Russia. That's not it at all. A better analogy is this. So there's a woman who realizes that she started dating a really bad guy, and the really bad guy is in charge of this biker gang, and so she feels like trapped. I can't go anywhere. So they're out at a restaurant, and the football team from the local college comes in, and she's with the biker gang guy, and she realizes, okay, this is my chance to escape. And so she runs across the restaurant to the biggest, baddest football player that she finds, the biggest, tallest, most muscle-laden guy, and says, I'm going to be your girlfriend. Please protect me. And he's like, yeah, sure, no problem. And the biker gang backs down. This is what happened with every former Warsaw Pact country, including some of these, the Baltic states, which are actually absorbed into the Soviet Union, not just Warsaw Pact, but Soviet Union proper. They all ran and fled into the arms of NATO in order to get away from Soviet aggression. It wasn't that NATO was going east, it was that they were trying to get away from the danger that was posed by Russia.
Well, maybe because in 3 decades Russia has invaded or incited war in at least 3 of its neighbors. Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine.
All of them not in NATO. Like, recognize this is important.
At the same time, Russia has not dared to invade any of its NATO neighbors. Do you see the pattern? The only reason for countries in the vicinity of Russia to seek NATO membership has always been and remains the need to protect their people from Russia.
That's right.
Therefore, Moscow has only itself to blame for the fact that all of the Central European and Baltic nations ran away from it and hid under the NATO umbrella as quickly as they could. Do not let Russian officials or their supporters in the West fool you. Russia attacked Ukraine not because NATO expanded to the east or because Ukraine wanted to join NATO. Russia attacked because it denies Ukraine's right to exist and wants to conquer our land and kill our people. It is through our shared strength that we can and must stop Russia and put an end to its aggressive plans for the rest of Europe. For this to happen, keep supporting Ukraine and don't buy Russian lies.
Yeah, and so that's a really good summary. And when we look at the map of NATO, going from this in 1991, where all these former Warsaw Pact countries are now that by the time of the invasion in 2022, I understand what Russia's saying, that they're moving east, but they're not moving east. Now, Ukraine is not actually part of this. They're invited to the party, but they're not there yet. Okay? All these dark blue states are all NATO, and Finland joined after, and Sweden just joined, and it's all because they're running away from Russia's aggression. I remember days after Russia invaded Ukraine, watching the president of Finland come to meet with Biden in Washington, D.C., and I was explaining to my wife, yeah, he really is worried that Russia's going to invade Finland too before he can get under the shelter of the NATO umbrella. Okay. That's all that I have about NATO. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and the coffees. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.